Stephanie, can you hear us okay?
I think you're muted.
No, says I'm not muted.
Now you're unmuted. That's great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We'll get started in about 4 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. We're here for the Public Safety Advisory Committee for February 27th. Going to call the meeting to order. And the first item on our agenda is the adoption of the agenda for today. Mover, Humphrey, and seconder. And all those in favor, any? Okay, it passes. Second item is the adoption of minutes. Bernier, second by Chris, and all those in favor? None opposed, it carries. We don't have very much today, but we do have a riveting presentation.
For sure.
Well, are you going to?
I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Introduce.
All right. Yeah. So my name is Heather Cower. I'm the Director of Community morning, and my team is working on the official community plan update. Senior Planner Ryan Perry is going to be doing the presentation today, and it's a great one. Yeah. Okay.
It's a great one, and even if not everybody understands a little bit of the coastal key, it's like quick.
You bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to connect with you today. Excited to give you an update on the OCP update process, but yeah, we talking about what the OCP is, its role within the city, and how it relates to development and the way the city is intended to grow. So it's the city's highest level plan. It's really the roadmap for the city's growth and all the elements and components of the community and how they're organized within the community and where that growth is expected to occur in a planned way. Below the OCP, there is a lot more detail that the city works on through various strategies and plans that get into more detail around accessibility, as an example, parks, rec and culture, transportation, master planning, utility planning. So those are all components below the OCP that essentially take some guidance from the OCP, but get into the more detailed and often operational non-land use type things happens in those strategies, but the OCP does touch on them at a high level. So please feel free if I use a term or talk about a topic that you would like me to unpack a bit further, please stop me. I'm happy to answer questions along the way and clarify anything or hear your feedback. So
that's good. You're okay with questions along the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So yes, today I'd like to share a bit about the process, provide a general update, but really share and discuss some of the stage 2 new directions that are now guiding the preparation of OCP policies and changes in stage 3. And I will explain what those stages are in a few minutes. But I do want to start with providing context on what the existing OCP urban structure is. So how is the city envisioned to grow? What types of development and residential uses and other things are happening in which locations? I'd also like to talk about and give a summary of the engagement that we had for stage 2 last year in 2024 and how that has led to what we're calling new directions. Essentially, where can we make some changes to the plan to improve it and consider today's context? And then I'll conclude with next steps. So in very high level view, the official community plan takes a long-term view. It's looking at the next 25 years, and it's looking at taking and guiding the growth of our city to a population of about 250,000 people. That when we hit that 250,000 people will depend on a lot of factors. International and national policy and migration are certainly factors that can influence that. We've been a high growth community in the last number of years. So the point being, this is a long-term view. So the things that we're going to talk about happening, we're looking at guiding in the plan are not going to happen overnight, but they're more of a 25-year period that will occur.
Ronnie, why do we look at population instead of years?
Population so that the housing needs report is one of the key things we need to look at when we're updating the OCP is looking at what is our growth in the city and how do we ensure that we have the land uses in place to accommodate the housing needs associated with that growth. And the housing needs report goes into even more detail to look at where are the areas that the city needs to do more or provide more opportunity for certain types of housing, be it affordable housing or family-oriented housing, things like that, or seniors housing. So yeah, looking at the population growth is important so that we make sure that our housing supply and our employment are keeping pace with the population growth.
What is our population right now?
Today, we use BC Stats. We're hovering at around 170,000 at the moment. So, whoops, sorry. Oh, are we fighting each other? All right, I'm gonna go forward one more here. So I'm gonna pause on this slide for a moment. So the white outline is the city boundary. The black outline is what we call the urban development boundary. And the urban development boundary is really helping us differentiate between our farming areas, which you see in green, which make up about 72% of the city, most of which are in the agricultural land reserve. And that black area is really where the official community plan and council are focusing land use changes to accommodate growth. So we're not looking at expanding residential uses out into the ALR. We're looking at concentrating and growing inwards and upwards within that urban development boundary. So you'll see this urban development boundary, or I'll sometimes refer to it as the UDB. It's a real key component of the official community plan. It's probably the highest order organizing element of saying this is where the city is going to grow for the most part. But within that, the plan goes into a fair bit of detail around how to organize that growth. This is all tied to the existing official community plan. So I want to touch on a number of these key elements before we start talking about what the changes might look like. So the current OCP talks about ensuring or guiding 75% of new growth to centers, so mixed use centers where we have commercial, residential, as well as our existing neighborhoods where we have, in many cases, single detached dwellings, but there is a diversity of housing out there.
Why is it that we are choosing to do that?
To concentrate, yeah, efficiency and efficient use of services. A lot of these areas already have servicing that can go through updates or improvements rather than a complete new construction, which is much more cost effective. We also have many local amenities that can serve a new population and various strategies like the Mill Lake Master Plan is a good example where they look at what is the future need of and who will be using this park and how can it be improved to support that population. So it's really about efficiency and convenience and really trying to build on our transit network, our cycling network, and our walking network to have less reliance on vehicles. The remaining 25% of growth is expected to happen in new neighborhoods. So this is the McKee and Augustin areas. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in a moment. So looking at the heart of the city center is where we are today, sitting at this table. Many parking lots and strip malls today, but the vision for this area is for it to become the most vibrant part of the city with the highest and most intensive diverse range of uses. So employment, residential towers, really seeing it shift from that auto-oriented type core to a much more pedestrian focused 24-hour of activity being residential and commercial all mixed together. And importantly, that blue line is the primary transit corridor, which is sort of the backbone of the plan. Saying let's focus most of our growth along this primary transit corridor to make sure people are connected in a way that doesn't rely entirely on vehicle cars. So building on the city center, the next level down in the hierarchy of centers is the urban centers. So these are secondary in terms of scale and intensity. The city's 4 mixed-use centers are connected by that primary transit corridor to the city center and to each other. And together, the city center and these urban centers are envisioned for the most redevelopment and intensification of uses. Moving out from there, the current plan envisions the surrounding existing neighborhoods for gentle infill of smaller lot, single detached dwellings, duplexes, and detached suites. But I will be coming back to this because there have been some provincial housing changes that have now require more than just single detached dwellings in these areas. So I'll touch on that in more detail. And then as we move even further from there, we have large areas of existing neighborhoods that are characterized by single detached dwellings and secondary suites with some townhomes in there as well. And supporting those outer neighborhoods, the plan envisions the further evolution of these neighborhood centers, which are currently envisioned as 4-story commercial ground floor with apartments above, surrounded by uses such as townhouse or apartment. So really thinking about neighborhood destinations that can serve the daily needs of residents and hopefully in a manner that's walkable for many of those surrounding residents. And then lastly, on the residential side, the urban structure has our new neighborhoods, which are now guided by the recently completed McKee neighborhood plan, which includes a mix of housing types and uses. Now, I've talked a lot about residential, but equally important is supporting that residential with a stronger local economy and job base. We have very good stats around people not having to commute a long distance to work, and we'd love to maintain that, but it'll depend on ensuring our employment policies and land uses can support additional job growth. So that includes those mixed use centers that I talked about, which could have a commercial, could have office, services, institutions, but as well as our regional and large format commercial or smaller format commercial and industrial lands. So those purple, many of the purple areas you see there are industrial lands and form a very large part of our job base, important component of our job base. And we do know we're running out of industrial land, so that's a component you'll see that we touch on later in the presentation. Now, I mentioned that there have been some changes at the provincial level around legislation. And these are a major consideration in updating the city's urban structure policies. So one significant change relates to Bill 44, which was passed in 2023. The city is now required to allow up to 4 dwelling units on all lots that were previously restricted to single detached dwellings or duplexes. And council passed zoning bylaw updates late last spring in advance of the June 2024 deadline. This legislation is broad reaching, and not just for Abbotsford, it's the entire province or most of the province's cities. It impacts about 22,000 lots within the city, some of which are envisioned for higher densities in the OCP, and I'll touch on that shortly. The city has taken, as I mentioned, an interim step to meet the legislation, but this OCP update provides an opportunity to look at further policy changes with the community and council to consider how the OCP best responds to this new legislation. So it's a big change, but it's an exciting opportunity to think about how we rethink our urban structure.
So also on July 30th, 2024, council had approved the secondary suite applications. So have you found that there are a lot of people applying to that program through BC Housing or no?
Great question. The secondary suite incentive program?
Yes.
It's got a cap to it too.
It does have a cap, yeah. I haven't checked. I know there was a fair bit of interest at the beginning of the process. I haven't looked at the numbers recently. Are you aware of how it's been
Yeah,
progressing?
there's been a good uptake, and at least from our perspective, I think we have we have money to provide grants for up to 150 units, secondary suites, and about half of those either have been granted or are under application. And there's a certain percentage of those that were illegal suites. So I think there's something like 2/3 of those where people had illegal suites and now are making those legal, which was part of the incentive program. But yeah, there's been a pretty good uptake of the program.
Regardless of the uptake, I don't think it's made that much of a dent in this bigger picture, right, of density and densifying.
Yeah, I mean, you're really only adding 1 unit per lot with the secondary suite incentive program. I mean, and the incentive program is looking at legalizing existing suites and adding suites to existing homes. But a lot of the new houses that we get in have a secondary suite assumed that's also being built. And the secondary suite incentive program doesn't take that into account. So we are getting more secondary suites just in the regular building process. But as you say, Chair, it's 1 additional unit per lot, you know, when you're talking about secondary suites.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another factor I would layer on top of that, though, is it's also increasing the affordability of the principal residence. It's now a mortgage helper that may not have been an option for folks in the past without the incentive. So yeah, it's an exciting piece, but it's just one piece of that bigger puzzle, and it is more incremental. Yes, through the chair.
Where the previous slide, or 2 slides before, showed taking a lot and building 4 residences on it. Is there a restriction in the size of that lot to do that?
Whether you can do 3 units or 4 units, yes, and I believe it's 280 square meters is the threshold written into the legislation. So the city has to allow up to 3 units if a lot is 280 square meters or below, or 4 units if it's above.
You don't know where they're going to park their car, but that's.
Yeah, and we do have a number of slides that touch on this specific topic, and happy to unpack some of those questions at that time.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the question. So stage one of the official community plan did a fair bit of reflecting on how the official community plan's been progressing. So I've just provided an overview of the very broad urban structure of how the city is intended to grow through that plan. But we wanted to understand how is it doing in relation to that. So we talked about a 75% target for those existing and mixed use centers. The plan also looked to have 60% of the city's growth happen, residential growth happen in that urban core, that red shaded area. The actual growth through approved applications was about 65%. So it's tracking well. We're seeing growth in areas we want to be seeing it. Looking at the existing neighborhoods, the target for the OCP in this part of that existing area was 15%. It's actually 28% of approvals happened in these areas. Now, some of that 28% is likely due to the lack of development happening up in the new neighborhoods area. And a big reason for that not progressing beyond 7% is that the McKee neighborhood plan was in process and there was no applications being accepted in certain areas during that planning process. The plan is now complete. So most of the previous development we saw in the neighborhood would have been in areas such as Augustin that were already established. But we expect this number to go up now that the McKee plan is finished. We're seeing commercial happening in the areas where the plan wants to see it. The plan is looking to see more of that commercial go into mixed use centers. And while we want it, it's around 70%, 54% is actually still quite good. This is probably the most exciting one to look at. When we look at our housing, the housing types that are being built between 2016 and 2022, we know we have a lot of single detached dwellings existing in the city, but to increase housing choice and housing attainability, we know we need to diversify that, and we're seeing that happening. Of new approvals that are going before council, 65% of those are apartments or semi-detached at about 25%. So the single detached lot approvals is really making up only 10% of our units that are being approved. So it's diversifying the housing stock in Abbotsford. So that's a bit of a snapshot on the current plan and how it's been progressing. I'll shift gears now to the OCP update itself. I'll pause there. Were there any questions about the previous slides before I jump into the current process? Yes.
Just from our perspective, what is the trigger for like population density, say in the key neighborhood area we're talking about for emergency services?
Yeah, and that's something we would work with Abbotsford Fire Rescue Service on, making sure they're at the table during the planning processes, which they would have been with McKee, to understand how do those densities relate to demand for fire halls and how does that get factored into the plan.
Yeah, just based on the response times to that area as they currently exist. Yeah. Are I mean, like a lot of the houses in Augustin are sprinklered due to the response times. So I'm just kind of curious as to at what point did, but yeah, no,
yeah, it's collaboration. The other interesting thing about McKee that's something new for the city is wildfire interface design guidelines, which was a big consideration that made it into that plan, recognizing we're in a bit of a different context than we used to be in.
Yeah, and then adding the fire smart component to that too, and how people are building and utilizing proper building supplies to stay safe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question.
So Ryan, what you're saying is that when these processes are taking place, please fire, everybody's at the table, right?
That's right, yeah.
So,
same with the OCP update happening now. So that happened with the McKee neighborhood plan, but our we call it the technical advisory group. It includes representatives, typically directors from each of the city's departments and divisions. So we'll have some water, fire, transportation, parks, rec, and culture. So it gives a really great diverse lens. So we coordinating and talking to one another throughout the process.
Is the school district at that table?
They're not, because they are an external agency, but we are in constant contact with them as well. In fact, we were just giving a very similar presentation to the trustees 2 weeks ago, and we work with their staff.
I think Stephanie has a question.
Yeah, hi, Stephanie.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, quick question. I was wondering, are there any existing cities or models that the OCP has been based off that isn't Abbotsford, like maybe a city that's a source of inspiration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I
Maybe
think
we are the inspiration.
it was before my time, so I can brag about it a little bit. So I'm not taking any credit for this whatsoever, but the plan that was adopted in 2016 did win awards for being recognized as a really solid plan and having a great engagement program. So yes, I think we do get calls about how the process went. But I think a lot of the planning principles that are being were looked at in 2016, as well as top of mind now, are pretty standard planning principles we see throughout the Lower Mainland around ensuring coordination of transportation and density, and coordinating amenities and other needs that support residential growth. So I wouldn't say there's just one planning or one or two plans that we're looking at. I think we definitely take a scan and are continually watching what other municipalities are doing to see what best practices are. And that's particularly relevant with the recent provincial housing changes. It's a pretty big shift, and everybody is dealing with it a little bit differently, but we can certainly learn from the other municipalities on how to find the right solution for the Abbotsford context.
Ryan, before
Okay,
you
thank
move on,
you.
sorry, do you have another question, Stephanie?
Yes, I did just one more. My other question, it might come up later too, is just around transit, because I know there's been a lot of discussion around transit within the city. But what about connecting the city to other municipalities in the Lower Mainland? What's the city's role in that?
Yeah, excellent. Part of that is our transportation planners would be better qualified to answer that, but I can certainly give you the OCP perspective. So the Fraser Valley Express is a really important regional connection where we have stops at the McCallum interchange as well as High Street. So we certainly have that on our minds when we think about our city's priority transit routes and how land uses respond to that. And we also know that SkyTrain is making its way further out into the valley. So while there are no specifics about when or if that will eventually make it to Abbotsford, it's certainly on our minds of how we connect to the broader region, either through Mission with BC Transit or out towards Langley and Chilliwack through the Fraser Valley Express and ultimately onto Lougheed Station for SkyTrain, eventually closer.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
thank you. I'm just going to ask the GM of engineering to give us a bit better response here.
Through the chair, just to add to what Mary has said, connection with Mission is well established through a joint Central Valley Transit system that we share with Mission. The connection with Chilliwack, as Mary outlined, is covered with the Fraser Valley Express, and that connection goes all the way up to Langley and ties into TransLink's infrastructure. With regards to the future connection to SkyTrain, one of Council's priorities for this term was to continue advocating for that connection to ultimately bring SkyTrain out this way over the coming decades. But in the meantime, our transportation staff are at the table with TransLink staff as they make their future action plans to ensure that there's coordination of two transit systems so that the user from here who would like to connect with the SkyTrain will be able to do so once that's all in place.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, so Ryan, like I was saying, before you go on, you had mentioned that 2% of our land is in ALR. So we have industrial land, so but that doesn't really leave a lot of land for housing. So why is it that we're doing this? So often I'll hear people say, can you, why are we encouraging people to come here and live here? And do you have, I have thoughts on that, of course, but what's your perspective of that?
Well, I think that's where we need to be strategic regarding where we grow up and rethinking some of the land uses that are in strategic locations, such as our mixed use centers, the city center, our neighborhood centers, our urban centers along that transit corridor. Again, back to your comment around why grow inwards and that efficiency and the use of existing services and the ability to enhance those existing services, I think is a big priority. So it's rethinking better use of existing lands.
Because we can't stop population growth. In fact, healthy communities grow.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay, so the official community plan update process, it follows the city's typical 4-stage process. Stage 1 involved a bunch of background research, understanding what our current context was, what legislation has changed, how has the city changed since the last OCP update, and what are some of the opportunities to improve the OCP. Stage 2, explore new directions, was when we were out in the community talking about various, well, first of all, talking about what are some of the key issues that the community is now grappling with and the city is grappling with, as well as what are the opportunities that exist to improve the official community plan in today's context. That has led, and I'm going to touch on the new directions that came out of that. That's going to be where most of the rest of the presentation talks about. We recently moved into the prepare new policy stage, and that work is essentially looking at those new directions and getting more specific about what land use changes would help us make those or go down those new directions and what policy changes can help us get there as well. So, but I will spend a fair bit of time talking about the new directions themselves. Overall, the process is looking at updating all aspects of the OCP and providing zoning bylaw recommendations or updates to make sure that what's envisioned in the OCP is something that can happen following adoption. Press the wrong button, sorry. So the stage 2 report, I'm going to stay pretty high level, but it is available online if you want to dig into the details at the Let's Talk Abbotsford page. But everything I talk about in the next few slides is outlined in that report. The intent of the report is really to summarize the input about the early ideas and what we heard from the community, helping them understand that we did hear them and how that will feed into the policy changes that are starting to emerge through the planning process. The report includes 5 sections supported by appendices with more detailed engagement content. Chapter 1, and this gets to a point the councillor raised at the beginning of the meeting, is really making sure people understand what an OCP is, why we need to update it, what the overall process is, what is the purpose of this new directions report, and understanding the things such as the relationship of legislation to this plan and other strategies, trying to really piece that puzzle together for the reader at the front end so that they're understanding the context of these changes that are being discussed. And we know this is probably one of the most important times for an OCP to see community engagement, because there have been changes around rezoning proposals for residential. Legislation no longer permits a public hearing for a residential project that meets the intent of the official community plan. So if it aligns with the plan, there's no public hearing. So this is making the OCP update that much more important, that people understand and see what the vision is before it's adopted by council and have their opportunity to speak to it. The second chapter, I'm not going to go into the details of this, don't worry. The second chapter is really trying to provide an overview of the legislation that's changed, as well as the city's Federal Housing Accelerator Fund that they are part of. And there were 7 key initiatives, many of which can be moved forward through the official community plan update. So this chapter is a fair bit more technical, but it helps unpack some of the more complicated elements of what we need to consider. Chapter 3, engagement. So this was we got very lucky with the weather, as you can see on this slide. But throughout the month of May in 2024, we held 6 open house and pop-up events and had great turnout. We use this as our top opportunity to present the background research, but also talk about a number of ideas and get feedback on those ideas for improving the official community plan. So this part of the stage 2 report talks about who and how we engaged, how we raised awareness, what we talked about during engagement, and most importantly, what we heard from participants. We had close to 500 people and over 300 online survey responses, and a huge amount of written comments within those 300 responses. So the written comments become very valuable for us when we start to evaluate the more detailed elements of policies. The drop-in events were held at several locations around the city. It also involved hosting a World Cafe with with representatives from several local special interest organizations, including members of council committees. People like Chamber of Commerce, Urban Development Institute, school district, school board staff were at this one as well. So and Fraser Health was also at the table. So it's a great opportunity for representatives that have a much broader reach and network, but have a specific interest in supporting the community. So it was a great chance to hear from them with that lens. We also tried to reflect the engagement online as much as possible, and had great response with that as well. So from that engagement, we did find that there was a fair bit of support for the range of ideas being discussed to improve the OCP. Many had over 75% support, and those that had less than 75 were still in that 64 to 72% support range. But with the written feedback, we were able to start to understand what it was about those that didn't push people to the 75% support rate. Overall, we were very encouraged with the feedback and felt it was a great way to begin to prepare those new directions and ultimately start preparing policy. So with that in mind, that engagement led to what we've called stage 2 new directions. Those are those big moves to improve the OCP. And we generally found that they fell into 3 key categories: refining the big picture, so similar to the urban structure I talked about earlier, increasing housing affordability, diversity, and supply, and thinking beyond the residential and what supports are needed to guide things other than residential to support that growing population. They're organized into the key themes, new directions, but then the new directions report gets into more detail on how we get there. You'll notice that the new directions are fairly high-level statements, but the new directions report does get into detail about what that means, and I'll talk for a few minutes about that. So starting with the first one, new direction 1, it looks at updating the city's vision to reflect the city's role as the hub of the Fraser Valley. We know we need to also update our regional context statement that acknowledges the regional plan and how we fit into that. And local economy became quite evident as something that needed to be elevated in profile. It was part of the Make Places for People big idea or policy area, but given its importance, this idea was to raise that up as its own specific policy area and bolster that. So we now, if adopted by council, we would be seeing 8 big ideas instead of 7, and the new one being to support a thriving local economy. Next one is to expand and strengthen climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency policy throughout the OCP. So this would look at updating our greenhouse gas reduction targets, raising awareness of how the OCP addresses climate change and resiliency, and looking at things in our development permit guidelines that could potentially help us further support climate change and mitigation and adaptation. A lot of the land use plan is very much focused on, or has a very big co-benefit to climate change, not just livability, but climate change as well. And the intent is to try and draw attention to that and clarify that. The third new direction is to expand the primary transit corridor in consideration of regional transit, employment nodes, and priority growth areas. So when we think about how to get there on that idea, it would look at building on the successes of the existing urban structure by considering an extension of the primary transit corridor, which I showed earlier as a blue line, that is shown in yellow here, extending that primary transit corridor out to High Street, recognizing that Fraser Valley Express connection and that regional connection beyond the city and into the city. It also looks at a new leg of the primary transit corridor, or the key transit corridor, down Clearbrook Road and down Marshall, recognizing the hospital as a key destination and Clearbrook Road as a key gateway corridor to the city. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later in the presentation. We also took a look at, this new direction takes a look at the urban center. So building from that city center core outwards, we have some key destinations at U District, McCallum, Historic Downtown, and Clearbrook. And currently these areas are capped at 6 stories for apartment, but because of their location on the transit corridor, there may be the potential to explore taller buildings in these areas through density bonusing, which would provide some funding that could go to that Affordable Housing Reserve Fund. We do know there's some flight path implications in some of these areas, such as Clearbrook, but the idea being more flexibility for more units through density bonusing in the right locations, such as on transit in these large, somewhat underdeveloped areas in some cases.
So Ryan, when you say transit corridors, so what you're really saying is So to mitigate car, we having the transportation there available for people to use instead of.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we know that that is something that will evolve, but it's really identifying that priority routing for higher service transit, but giving the option that we're not suggesting everyone's going to get rid of their cars, but if you can own one car instead of two because you live on the primary transit corridor, or maybe eventually no car, these are the areas that would be providing housing with that in mind. We're also looking at connecting some of the areas in the city and rethinking the area between historic downtown and city center, which is currently low density 1 to 2 story commercial, but does provide an opportunity along that transit corridor for the potential for 6-story apartment or mixed use along the transit route. We also see this as an opportunity on Clearbrook Road to help spur reinvestment along this gateway to the city and help link that land use to transit. Moving outwards, still under the same new direction, those neighborhood centers play an important role in providing local services and needs for the communities further from the core. But they're currently limited to 6 stories. We're seeing some development and investment in those, but not a lot. And so we're looking at opportunities to increase the viability of redevelopment in these areas where we might start to see some more mixed use development and more services and shops brought into that area, as well as residential. One way to do that is to increase the height limit of those neighborhood center mixed use areas from 4 stories that they're currently limited to 6 stories. We know 6 stories with recent building code changes is actually quite a viable housing option in Abbotsford. So it provides an opportunity for these centers to see some further investment. We're also looking at broader ways to ensure that our urban one zoning is working as best it can for the current market, but also opportunities to bring things, improve the viability of seeing hotels. We know and have heard through the engagement that our current limit on 4 stories for hotels is quite limiting, whereas a lot of the models today are looking at 6-story. So that is something we're looking at in strategic parts of the city to allow hotels to go a little bit higher. The next new direction relates to the area south of Mill Lake, between Mill Lake Park and the hospital. This new direction looks at exploring land use changes to establish a new mixed use area where you see that large star on the property. The idea being to explore higher density mixed use commercial and residential development, be it in low, mid, or high rise buildings, and exploring the opportunities for a vibrant public realm, enhanced street from the hospital to Mill Lake, creating a strong connection between that major employment node and Mill Lake Park. And thinking about it as an opportunity to better connect and complement with the hospital as a major destination and employer. And you can see how this concept now also fits with the idea of broadening and expanding that primary transit corridor to loop this potential longer term node to the bigger city. It's looking to consider housing that supports health campus workers and residents. We know we have an aging population, and this area does provide an important seniors care and housing opportunity. We're looking at opportunities to improve transportation connections to the area, and we'll be talking and have been talking to BC Transit as well to make sure that we're coordinated. But it does provide an opportunity when we think about healthcare workers. Back a moment. When you think about healthcare workers and the desire to attract healthcare workers, doctors, to have a neighborhood in close proximity with a diversity of housing options and convenient walking distance to the hospital could also help with that element of it. I know Fraser Health was quite interested in this idea as well. Going a little bit higher level, not specific to any one site, but the OCP is looking to broaden OCP policy for improving the supply of diverse and affordable housing options. So this is thinking about general policy statements around how we continue to support cooperative housing or below market housing as the city thinks about diversifying its housing stock and considering various levels of income availability. Shifting back to small scale multi-unit housing. So we've been talking a lot about that core area, and opportunities to add more mixed use or apartments. But moving out from that core area, we know we have very large existing neighborhoods that are now part of this small scale multi-unit housing legislation. And we are now revisiting the existing June 2024 changes and thinking about opportunities to consider expanding small scale multi-unit housing options in that outer band. We really see three, I'm going to go back a moment. There are really three key areas that seemed quite different when we started looking more closely at this. The yellow area, which is further from the core, the sort of light orange, which is part of what's currently called the infill, urban 3 infill area, where we've always envisioned a little bit more intensification. And then the darker orange is also part of that urban 3 infill area, but you can see it falling quite close to that core area of the city where we're exploring higher transit service and also higher densities in other parts of that area. So there's three different layers to what the new directions look to explore for broadening housing choice.
Makes sense because those are on the periphery of the core. So they're, it just isn't stall right there.
That's right.
Spill over.
Exactly, yeah. So the provincial changes are quite broad brush. We are trying to meet that legislation, but in a way that really considers the local Abbotsford context. So, and I'm going to walk through what that means here from a new directions perspective. So in that outer area, it's looking at providing, going a bit further than our existing zoning by allowing stratified duplexes with an accessory unit or units in the back, allowing a single detached dwelling to add a garden suite in the back, and still allowing single detached dwellings. But so the orange building you can see at the front, the light orange, so that, for example, could be a duplex with two separate owners on either side. One might have a suite, one might have a garden suite in the back to get to that 4 units. But it's thinking about that scale in the context of those existing neighborhoods, but still adding more housing choice. As we move a bit closer in, the new directions look at providing more flexibility in these peripheral, what we call peripheral urban 3 infill areas. And what we mean by that is giving the same options that those outer areas would have, but recognizing the location closer to the core, allowing further flexibility for small townhouse type development, allowing detached buildings, more stratification, and possibly more floor area to realize larger family oriented units. And then as we move even closer to the core, we're looking at, again, building on those outer permissions. So you see that diversity of those smaller scale single lot options, but thinking about this being within the core, close to some apartment areas, the idea here would be that if a certain number of lots can be put together, that there would be the opportunity to build a larger lot townhouse project that wouldn't be limited to the 4 stories, 4 units, but would provide a similar housing type, but in a more coordinated, larger scale form. We're also thinking about some of the major corridors that go out from the center of the city into other parts of the city. We know that these major corridors play a big role in transit, in bike routes, in pedestrian connections, and we have been giving a lot of thought to the impact of small scale multi-unit housing on these corridors. We know there's not, in many cases, there is not on-street parking for these areas. So trying to imagine a 4-unit project with driveways all the way along for 4 units on these major corridors is difficult to imagine how that would function in a way that's going to improve the street. So we are looking at specific roads where it would be appropriate to think beyond those 4-unit projects and think about potentially apartment near other centers or townhouse along here to start to minimize the driveways and really see the parking being dealt with on site rather than relying on any on-street parking or driveways at the front of the street. So this new direction looks at opportunities to improve affordable housing or non-market housing within the city for various groups. We know we have close to 50 places of worship within the urban development boundary. We have more even outside. the urban development boundary. But within that urban development boundary, this new direction looks at exploring the opportunity for place of worship sites to contribute to the supply of non-market or below market housing. So this is thinking about the fact that a lot of these sites have been under long held ownership. They're large. Some of the places of worship may be aging and in need of replacement. And this would provide the option to say, okay, well, if we're gonna, if the congregation is going to rebuild the church or a church or place of worship, maybe there's an opportunity for housing above, or maybe there's the opportunity for converting some of the parking and providing parking under the building to put housing in a corner of the property. So it's really trying to create a flexible option where we know BC Housing is often partnering with different groups to provide some non-market housing, be it for seniors, persons with disabilities, or other groups that the community aspect of many places of worship may align quite well with this policy. We're also thinking about schools, of course, and we know we are limited in how much we can do about schools. We know it's a provincial and school district aspect, and of course we're talking to the school district, but we often get application, or council sometimes gets applications for new private school sites, and we realize that the OCP doesn't have a whole lot of direction criteria for considering these. So we're looking at improving the guidance for new institutional uses such as schools or campuses and places of worship. We do have some policy in for places of worship, but we're looking at broadening that so we address school proposals as well. The local economy, important component of the growth plan. And we know that we need to be thinking about where are the jobs of the future going to go. The current OCP has what is called Special Study Area A and B, which are areas that the plan looks at further studying to consider new opportunities for employment. This new direction is essentially saying, let's affirm that those continue to be the priority areas for this further exploration, recognizing that a lot of work has gone into understanding industrial needs within the city and that these really have emerged as the key and most appropriate sites at this point in time. We're also coordinating closely with our Parks and Rec group to make sure that the OCP policies regarding parks is providing a good foundation as population grows, that we can provide the parks and rec and culture that's needed to support. A lot of the more detailed planning happens at the strategy level for this, but the OCP can play a role in providing high level direction. We're also looking at how development integrates with the environment and updating and enhancing guidance for development near steep slopes, hazard areas, and natural areas. And lastly, we are also thinking about, we're talking about adding population through a lot more multifamily housing, but we want to make sure that's livable. So we're taking a close look at our development permit guidelines and how the design of these buildings can be done in a way to make sure that they remain livable, but still provide those housing options. So thinking about where parking is located so that ground floors look a little bit more like you see on the right, rather than as a parking lot or a parkade entrance. Thinking about how our townhomes interface with streets. Again, thinking about where that vehicle parking is. And if you look on the right-hand side, it's really implying we'd love to see where we have walkable streets, that there's some living space on the ground floor so that we get buildings that are more connected to the street. Front doors coming down to the street rather than having a car parked in the front area. So I've thrown a lot at you there with those new directions, and I'm happy to unpack any of them and hear your perspectives on any of these elements. Our next steps include to continue preparing policies based on those new directions that I just walked you through. And we're looking to be out in the community in late spring with draft policy that could be seen in the OCP for feedback and to see and to get community's perspective on those changes before we take them to council for consideration of adoption.
I'm wondering if we can put that lens of public safety on this presentation to some degree and maybe have some questions related to that. Go ahead, Gertrude.
So is flood protection being incorporated into these designs?
Sorry, flood protection?
Yes.
A lot of the areas where we're looking at changes are outside of the floodplain.
Okay.
We do know that our engineering folks are doing a fair bit of work there. Is there any update?
Yeah, I can, with the chair, I'll speak to our subsequent phase. The OCP will include our master plans, drainage master plan, certainly does for us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Stephanie has a question.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting, even on a personal level. So thank you. I have hundreds of questions, but I'm going to try and keep it minimal. My first, so my first is, has the city of Abbotsford explored the inclusionary housing model with BC Housing as an option for increasing non-market units?
Are you taking that question?
Yeah. Inclusionary zoning, through the chair, inclusionary zoning was enabled through legislation last year, and we have been looking at it through this update, and we'll probably be talking about it a little bit more. Another opportunity we have is we do have an affordable housing strategy, and we will have to be doing another housing needs report update. So I imagine one of those efforts will be looking at inclusionary zoning.
Okay, yeah, because I don't know if because I don't know much about inclusionary zoning and if it's the same as inclusionary housing, but I know a bunch of different municipalities. They've been it's like a three-way partnership between the Ministry of Housing, BC Housing, and the municipality. And it's when developers are building new developments, there'll be like 3 units, for example, that are like earmarked just for I guess like subsidized housing. So I don't know if that's the same thing or not, but yeah, there seems to be growing interest in that space.
Sorry.
And then my other question was, during your consultations, were there any questions that you asked that you didn't get enough answers to, or you wish you'd got more of a response to?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There were a few topics where we just weren't at the stage to go into enough detail to get a lot of feedback. An example would be our Parks, Rec, and Culture direction that we went out with is to enhance park planning in relation to growth. I'm probably not paraphrasing that just quite right, but I think it would have been great to have a bit more detail then, but it wasn't really the right part of the process. I think we're going to hear a lot more on those responses when we bring out the more detailed policy this spring. So I think we did, it would have been great to hear a bit more on those topics then, but unfortunately it just wasn't at the point in the process to have that detail. Similar to employment.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's interesting.
As far as employment, we are one of those communities that we have a high number of individuals that live here and work here.
That's right.
In the 60s.
Yeah, it's
67 or something.
It's an unusually high stat for the region.
Sorry, I know this is a question for Parks and Rec, but do you know if there's going to be an increase in rec centers in the
That's the type of question that would be answered through the strategic planning. So once the OCP is updated, then the strategic planning and facility planning would follow, but through a more detailed process.
Would there be engagement for that, for the community to respond?
There typically is, yes. Yeah.
We have your opportunity.
yes, West Side, yes.
That's a good question.
Chris, any thoughts?
I'm just thinking with the densification, the infill, just more people in small areas, all with their own cultures and cooking, and there's just a lot more opportunity for problems to arise. I mean, I guess it's essentially similar to a townhouse complex, or kind of just make it work. So I'm just the creativity of how to get apparatus the size of the stuff that we have to get into some of these places is always a question that we have when they're developing some of these places. So just something we always kind of just try to throw it and keep people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something when we think about the small scale multi-unit housing detached, I think you were there. We talked a little bit about drive aisle access, talked a little bit about how, if there were an incident, how it would be approached from a response situation with their trucks on site. So yeah, no, very good point. Key
yeah, no, and yeah, like I said, we always appreciate that the considerations are made for that.
Yeah, it's interesting how you brought up like the different cultures and community engagement, like communities engaging with differences. And we are one of the top 3 most diverse communities, sometimes we're the most
Yeah,
diverse in
Like in
Canada.
Canada, yeah.
That's right, and then we have a lot of immigrant communities here. Our past mayor, he was a refugee, so we have a lot of refugees and, what a welcoming community. And I think it could present challenges, but it presents opportunities too. So we have a long history of making it work somehow. And how does that fit into a planning plan or policies?
That's a great question. My mind immediately went to how Parks, Rec, and Culture will often consider those factors when thinking about the needs of a park based on the neighborhood. From a OCP level, I think that the diversity of housing options and flexibility certainly can help with various family structures and people's preferences for living, whether it's intergenerational or not. Intergenerational on the same site, but maybe separate units. So I think the variety of what is going to be possible if this proceeds as it's been drafted is it's going to be a really interesting way to see how different needs are met.
And things change over time. When I used to go to university 30 some odd years ago, in my culture, in South Asian culture, oftentimes it was extended families. And now what I'm seeing amongst my colleagues is it's beyond South Asian communities. There's multi-generational for a lot of families. Affordability, lifestyle. So things change too. That's
Absolutely.
constant.
The maps showed that what was talked about is the tech district up on the east side. And is there a plan to densify up in that area in a different way than was planned with the tech district?
Yeah, so that application is no longer active. It did go to council and it's not proceeding. That area is now being guided through the McKee neighborhood plan, which does include the McKee village in that general area, which is a mixed use 6-story type village with residential. But yeah, the tech district project is not proceeding at this point in time.
So the question that was raised prior to your presentation was around issues of those individuals that find themselves homeless.
Mhm.
And then densifying might complicate things even further. Any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. I'm looking at Heather.
Yeah.
for
Do you
thoughts
think
on that.
somebody can benefit from a presentation from that area?
Like Socorro and
Yeah.
some of the measures, because there are a lot, I'm thinking about the land use versus the operational or support service side of things. The land use can certainly consider which uses are permitted where and how housing is, but I know a big part of that support relates to the services, wraparound services for that community. Anything to add to that?
Just that, housing affordability in general is one of the big factors really is supply. The more housing we can supply across the income spectrum is actually better for affordability overall. One of the examples that I'd heard recently was that it used to be that someone who was kind of had a marginal income could find a room for $400 a month. That housing doesn't exist anymore because those units are now so scarce that the landlord is able to increase rents much higher than that. Whereas if you build units kind of in the higher spectrum, let's say, everybody sort of moves up and those more affordable units become more available and rents start going down. And we have seen that recently. So housing supply is a big focus of our OCP and has been. But there are more opportunities too. And as I said, we have our affordable housing strategy and we also have our homelessness action plan. And those things overlap and speak to each other in terms of how do we house these folks? We also, when we're talking about public safety and increased densities, we're looking at it in the broader picture here with the OCP, but we also look at those things on a site-by-site basis. So, you know, we're considering the context. When somebody comes in with building, we're looking at the context of what's going on around it and how do we make that site more safe? You know, how do we add lighting to it in order to make it safer at night? Those kinds of things. So there's different aspects of public safety that are being considered at all sort of levels of development.
If you don't mind me adding to that, thank you, Heather. The topic I was anticipating to come up as well is around the site design and the city's multifamily and mixed use, well, in fact, all the design guidelines in the development permit areas, they do have an overarching lens of crime prevention through environmental design. And exactly what Heather's talking about is so many of them, even trying to activate the ground floor in that example I showed you, provides an extra level of eyes and activity on that street, sense of surveillance and ownership versus parking just being along the frontage. So there are a number of different elements that do get reviewed site by site to say, okay, how will each of the spaces be used and how do we maximize safety, activation of the frontages the way the plan envisions. So ultimately, the goal being public safety as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talked a lot about rezoning. Is there any way to speed up that process? Like if I look at taking my house and putting a suite in it, or tearing it down and doing one of those options you gave me, it's going to take 2 years. You know, and a lot of that's permitting, rezoning. So it's not attractive because I don't know in 2 years if I'll even be in the same house.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one issue. And then let's say I do put a suite in something. I have a regular house. You talked a little bit about the car frontage on a lot of the apartments and that type of thing, but a lot of the issues is just parking alone. And I don't see that in the plan for semi-detached. So I put a suite in my house, I'm renting it out. I've got 2 more cars in the driveway. So now I went from a 2-car driveway to a 4-car, and now those guys are parking next door. Right now I've got guys parking in front of my house because I've got suites all around me, right? I just don't think that's thought through. I saw it in the apartments and the going forward, but not in the semi-detached.
Yeah, thank you for the
It's kind of a 2-part question.
Yeah, maybe I'll tackle the first one around speeding up. Definitely something top of mind as we get into the details of how the implementation would work. We know that the longer a project takes, the less affordable it becomes because the money is spent carrying costs, et cetera. So we are looking at opportunities to the extent possible, to look at how the zoning can be in place for the intended use to the extent possible, and especially for the smaller scale projects where the resources to go through a rezoning process just may not be there.
Right.
So yeah.
Automating things. There's some discussions happening around that.
Right.
On the building permit side. Yeah, building permits are inevitable. We can't skip that
Absolutely.
step. But if we can get the zoning to a place that will allow something to move quicker, because it's matching what the OSP wants to do, we are looking at opportunities for that. And we'll have more information about that in the spring. Similarly, the parking question is something as we get into the details now with what's the zoning and how will the site need to be designed, we're definitely top of mind around how will parking be integrated.
Yeah, I think Surrey had, I'm thinking back years again, Surrey ran into that issue too, where they started redeveloping areas, but they didn't really plan for parking. So you had multiple people in different dwellings and they had street parking, but then everyone was running out of room and it was a big ordeal. So, I mean, yeah, I'm starting to see it down my street. You see cars just lined up, right? So.
I think what complicates matters for Abbotsford is that we are the largest geographic area in the sea.
Yeah, yeah.
I've tried taking the bus.
It takes a while to get around. Yeah, I know.
So if you have 4 adults in a home, 4 adults have the cars.
I know.
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum, unfortunately. But,
I don't think I think it you know, it's going to happen. There's going to be cars. It's our thinking around it.
The only thing I would add is in the development of that suite, you could put something in place saying you need to develop 2 parking spots in front of your dwelling. Something along those lines, right?
Yeah, we do have minimums and
Okay.
intend to have minimums of parking for each unit type. And it's the amount based on the type of unit we're anticipating.
Sure.
That is typically the discussion is how much parking should be required, given the unit sizes, how many people would be in them. But yes, our existing zoning includes a minimum parking for suites and principal residences. And we anticipate that any new zoning would also take into account what is the minimum parking needed to be provided.
And we had a bit of a discussion before you started about checking people's garages and seeing what's in them, because certainly isn't there.
They don't use them, yeah.
We've been living through this era where those illegal suites have been filling up the roads with cars. And people's cars get bumped into and rearview mirrors ripped off and various things have been happening and people just kind of hide on it. And it's good to hear that it's part of this planning process. I just like to get rid of the people that haven't been following the planning process and putting these illegal suites in and not paying the taxes they should be paying. Because BC assessment, I don't think it exists anymore. I think it's underground someplace.
And then,
It
you
is.
know, we have responsibilities too, as, you know, I'm in a position with my colleagues where we have some responsibility because there must be some type of need there in the community too. Now that we're seeing that governments are catching up and saying that, you know, we're in a situation where we don't have affordable housing. We don't have the types of housing that the community needs. And to say that, you know, to ignore it or, you know, not to address it doesn't help. And so we're being forced as a community, especially with some of the new legislation with provincial government, to really look at these areas because clearly people need housing and they were making it work somehow. And, you know, that doesn't help either, like for a multitude of reasons. Safety is lots.
Sure.
Sorry, finish your thought, yeah. I was just gonna ask, what is it like with the infill and the intensification? What are the anticipations for like infrastructure upgrades for sewage, water, things like that, for those areas? Are they robust enough to deal with the extra people and usage?
Yeah, excellent question. That's one of the big roles of the master planning process that typically follows. We have in the technical advisory group as part of this process, people from water, sewer, water, sanitary, et cetera, sitting at the table and transportation. So it's not as though they're going to wait till the end to tell us things. But a lot of the more detailed work does happen in that master planning stage. The other thing too is we know that this isn't going to happen overnight. We have a population growth rate of a certain amount, and that only means so many houses per year or residences per year, and that can fluctuate. So I don't think we anticipate a wholesale change within a year or two of some of these neighborhoods. It could be figuring out how to best build these projects and what works financially. So it's probably going to be more incremental.
Thank you.
The feedback I hear typically is, you know, people don't like change. Lots of times, they don't want their neighborhoods to change. They don't want where they go to the grocery store to change, or the structure of, you know, the roads. But it's going to happen. That's one of our responsibilities, to prepare and have that foresight that this is going to be happening. How can we mitigate some of the issues that you all have brought up to some degree?
Yeah, well said. Yes, there are trade-offs, and that's part of parking, green space.
I guess my last note is we never really talked about federal. So like number one, is there any communication on developing that, getting people in and out of I mean, we talked about within the corridor or within, you know, expanding that. But I know like the number one highway is always busy, right? I know they expanded somewhat, but is that integrated into your plan as well?
Yeah, so we keep Ministry of Transportation in the loop as to what's happening. In fact, they're certainly interested in our interchange areas and how development and increased density could affect access to highways. And that's where our transportation division also plays a big role. They're in constant communication, either through development applications or other planning processes to understand what is the Highway 1 expansion and how does our city network and infrastructure best coordinate with that.
Right.
Do we have any other questions, thoughts? Great, thank you for your presentation. That was really, I think it probably helped answer some of the questions that.
Yeah, certainly did.
Great. Yeah, I know it's a bit lengthy, so thanks for your patience.
Yeah.
But,
It's a big thing.
we're trying to have a well-rounded response, so thank you. for your
Stephanie,
time.
are you okay? Do you have any thoughts or questions?
No, I was just saying thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank you very much to the committee and do our best to keep you posted along the way.
Yeah, I'm not sure who do I speak to about the agenda, having some presentation on business initiatives. Is that something that you all are interested in for?
I think so.
We have one action.
Yeah.
We should be second.
Yeah. Sorry, so Chris Teason was going to second the adoption of minutes, but he's not actually a voting member.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah, he's just filling in for the fire chief
Oh, okay.
as a staff
Sorry, I
liaison.
said, I don't think I've met you before.
I am so sorry. I was just trying to be compliant.
Oh, that's okay. Remember, so that was great. Okay, so can we have somebody else?
Sure.
Yeah. Pat. Do you just need a?
We just need one.
Okay, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so this brings us to adjournment. Can we have a mover, second by Preet. There, none opposed, it carries. Thank you very much. Our next meeting is on May 22nd.